Welcome to the Network News Live. We are the Bay Path Student Newsroom, covering events both on campus and in the outer world. I'm Julia DeRitter.
And I'm Rebecca Weiner. On today's program, we're going to be talking about voting. With the local election coming up in November and the next presidential election on the horizon, we want to stress the importance of using your vote to create change.
We will be interviewing two esteemed faculty members at Bay Path, Dr. Robert Surbrug and Elizabeth Cardona.
Here's why voting should not just be an option anymore.
Welcome. Today I will be interviewing Dr. Surbrug. He is the Honors Director and he is a history professor at Bay Path University. Thank you so much for joining us and thank you for wearing your Constitution tie.
My pleasure.
All right, so we're just going to jump right into the questions. The first one is, what are key trends in the races today of what we need to pay attention to?
I think the big trend is the impact that the Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case is going to have on this election. Typically, in midterm elections, supporters of the party out of power show up in large numbers, and members of the party in power don't come out as much. So typically we would expect to see high turnout by Republican voters in this election and low turnout by Democratic voters. But the Dobbs decision has really stirred the pot politically and engaged a lot of people who typically would not be engaged during a midterm election. And so I think the trend that a lot of political pundits and observers are looking to is to see how much that upsets the typical pattern of midterm elections where the party in power loses seats in Congress.
Would you mind explaining more of what this Dobbs is?
Yeah, well, that was the decision by the Supreme Court based on a case of abortion providers in Jackson, Mississippi, that overturned the Roe versus Wade decision, the constitutional right for women and others to have abortions up through a certain period, and that right has been there for 50 years. And so that decision basically took away that right and returned the decision whether abortion will be illegal or not, currently to the states, but potentially going forward, the Congress could make national laws either guaranteeing the right to abortion or denying, creating a national ban on abortion. So now basically every election is going to have an impact on whether or not that right is preserved or taken away.
Okay, and you think that's what voters will be focusing on in this race?
That's one of the things we don't know. That's one of the things that a lot of people are looking at. So far, there was a special election in Kansas to vote on a referendum dealing with abortion rights, and Kansas is typically a very conservative state, but the Dobbs decision galvanized so many people, especially women and others who are directly affected by that Dobbs ruling, that they turned out in large numbers and defeated the effort to take away the right to abortion in Kansas.
Okay, well, thank you for that. What are you seeing that makes you want to rally students to vote?
I think one of the big issues is this is setting the table for the 2024 presidential election. And who is in charge at the state level is going to have a big impact on how that turns out. In the last election, we saw efforts to get certain state officials to change the results of the vote by one of the candidates who was not happy with the results. And fortunately, nobody did that. But there are candidates running now who have already said that no matter what the outcome of the election in 2024, that they are going to be inclined to support a certain candidate should that candidate run again, regardless of the votes in that state. So that the voters now have the opportunity to make sure that people who are committed to free and fair elections at the state level, which includes secretaries of state, governors, state legislatures, and so forth, are elected to office, so that if any efforts are made to try to undo the electoral result in 2024, that they'll be unsuccessful. So there's a lot more riding on this midterm election than I think a lot of people know.
Are there certain states that should be more of a focus, paying attention to who they will be electing, or is that every state?
I would say particularly swing states that are have close elections. In our region, probably that would be New Hampshire and Maine, certainly Pennsylvania, a lot of the Midwestern states, and if we have any Florida voters out there, certainly Florida. So it will be mostly in those very close states where the decision is always razor thin, that will be really, really important.
Okay, well, moving on to the last question. Why is it important to vote?
Well, I think it's important to vote in every election. In 2020, we saw a record turnout by all different groups of voters across the board, but most importantly, young voters, which was significant given the important issues from climate change to education, gun violence, and so forth that disproportionately affect younger voters. But trends are typically younger voter turnout falls down in off-year elections, in what's called midterm elections. And that's something I hope to reverse, because people do get excited when there's a presidential election and there's a candidate. Voting in midterms is a little harder because there's a lot to learn, but they are just as consequential, because who's in Congress, who's in the state legislature is going to impact all of those issues, whether it's climate change, LGBTQ plus rights, gun violence, and so forth. And so I think there's too many issues at stake, and the president doesn't have this absolute power. Much of what gets done is getting done in state legislatures, especially with other issues like police violence and so forth, racial justice, but also in the Congress. So I think for young people, and there's been studies that show when young people show up to vote early in life on presidential and midterm elections, that becomes a lifelong practice. So I think it's really important, probably more now than at any point in my lifetime, for everybody, but especially young voters, to become engaged and stay engaged.
Well, thank you again for joining us.
I'm here with Bay Path Director of Multicultural Affairs, Elizabeth Cardona. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So we know you've been involved in efforts to register people to vote. What do you think some of the hardest aspects of that process has been?
I believe that for many individuals that have not engaged in voting or been part of campaigns, sometimes they hesitate because they feel that their vote doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And so it's really about educating the voter about what is it, why it's so important, what the process is. And so I think that once many individuals learn and understand the value that they bring, they're able to participate. We change their minds.
Right, absolutely. So how do you think that voting impacts specifically minorities, people of color in the community?
Well, it's very important that every citizen, every individual has the opportunity to participate in the society that they hope for. Right. And so sometimes policies are created without really thinking about the impacts that it has on diverse constituents. And so that's why it's important that people of color are able to participate, so that they have, and not just people of color, people with different identities are able to participate, so that they have their interests being put forth.
So on a personal level, finally, why do you feel that it's important to vote?
I have seen throughout my life how voting and participating in voting, and not just participating in voting, but paying attention to policies, and then engaging with elected officials, has impacted my life personally. I grew up in the north end of Springfield, an area that had a lot of social issues. And when I saw my community getting more involved, change happened. One example that I can give you is ward representation. For a very long time, many of the elected officials came from one or two different communities, different from mine. And so getting involved in that campaign to turn things over, so that each of the districts had someone representing them that lived in that district, that could identify some of the issues that that community needed, and then represent it in terms of policy, in terms of resources. I've seen that, I've witnessed that myself, and because of that experience, and because I've seen the impacts of that, I am very passionate and believe that voting matters.
Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Thank you.
It was great to hear from our faculty members and staff. To me, voting is so important because it's one of the only actions regular citizens have to attempt to make their votes and their voices heard, which is also why it's important to make sure voting is accessible to all. Personally, I'm trying to vote for a world I can live in, not as a child, not as someone's grandchild, not for my own grandchildren, but for myself, to make my years on Earth as habitable as possible.
In this era of uncertainty, I hope to be able to contribute to our country's political process to speak out about the issues that impact me as a queer woman, as an American, and as a human being.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss the importance of voting, and make sure you head to the polls on November 8th.